shows Chris Farley, who says, "Hey everybody! Our host for our special centennial show is the first president of the United States of America, George Washington." Applause, applause, applause. Now, President Washington wanted to recite some excerpts from his farewell address. Mr. Joe King brought me in as a test audience, and I had no clue what Washington was talking about. Therefore, after Washington recites a section of his farewell address, we will have different people come out and translate it by dumbing it down a bit. And live from Tom's phone, we're not alive.
It's Saturday Night Live SNotL, starring an ever-evolving cast that is unionized and refuses to allow their names to be mentioned until their demands are met. Musical guest, Nelly, Custis, and your host, George Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, George Washington.
Applause, applause, applause. Shows Washington, who says,
"I sincerely thank you for that warm reception. In looking forward to the moment which is intended to terminate the career of my public life, my feelings do not permit me to suspend the deep acknowledgement of that debt of gratitude which I owe to my beloved country for the many honors it has conferred upon me, still more for the steadfast confidence with which it has supported me, and for the opportunities I have thence enjoyed of manifesting my invaluable attachment by services faithful and persevering, though in usefulness unequal to my zeal."
Chris Farley comes out and says, "Well, I'm leaving. Thanks for being so cool to me, America. You were always there for me and gave me the chance to be there to serve you." Washington.
"If benefits have resulted to our country from these services, let it always be remembered to your praise and as an instructive example in our annals that, under circumstances in which the passions agitated in every direction were liable to mislead, amidst appearances sometimes dubious, vicissitudes of fortune often discouraging, in situations in which not unfrequently want of success has countenanced the spirit of criticism, the constancy of your support was the essential prop of the efforts and a guarantee of the plans by which they were effected."
Uma Pemarau comes out and says,
"If I did a good job, it's because you always had my back, even though I had my haters."
Washington.
"The unity of government which constitutes you one people is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize."
David McCullough comes out and says,
"You love the unity of government, because without it, you wouldn't have it so well."
Washington.
"But as it is easy to foresee that, from different causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken, many artifices employed, to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth. As this is the point in your political fortress against which the batteries of internal and external enemies will be most constantly and actively, though often covertly and insidiously, directed, it is of infinite moment that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness, that you should cherish a cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment to it, accustoming yourselves to think and speak of it as if it were the palladium of your political safety and prosperity, watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety, discountenancing whatever may suggest even a suspicion that it can in any event be abandoned, and indignantly frowning upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link together the various parts."
Abraham Lincoln comes out and says,
"Eventually people will try to weaken our unified government. Do everything you can to stop them. Just avoid the theater.
Washington.
While then every part of our country thus feels an immediate and particular interest in union, all the parts combined cannot fail to find in the united mass of means and efforts greater strength, greater resource, proportionally greater security from external danger, a less frequent interruption of their peace by foreign nations, and, what is of inestimable value, they must derive from union an exemption from those broils and wars between themselves which so frequently afflict neighboring countries not tied together by the same government, which their own rivalships alone would be sufficient to produce, but which opposite foreign alliances, attachments, and intrigues would stimulate and embitter. Hence, likewise, they will avoid the necessity of those overgrown military establishments, which under any form of government are inauspicious to liberty, and which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to republican liberty. In this sense it is that your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty, and that the love of the one ought to endear to you the preservation of the other.
John Belushi comes out and says,
We're all better together. When we fight with each other, we act like dicks and try to take each other's freedoms away. So if you love your freedom so much, stop fucking around and see us all as one group in this together.
Washington.
In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection.
Gilda Radner comes out and says, parties can fuck up the union. Parties try and gain power by lying about the other side, and these lies drive us apart when we should be together as Americans. Washington.
To the efficacy and permanency of your union, a government for the whole is indispensable. No alliances, however strict, between the parts can be an adequate substitute. They must inevitably experience the infractions and interruptions which all alliances in all times have experienced.
John Hancock comes out and says,
if we are going to last and be successful, we can't cut corners. The government has to be for everybody.
Washington.
Sensible of this momentous truth, you have improved upon your first essay by the adoption of a constitution of government better calculated than your former for an intimate union and for the efficacious management of your common concerns. This government, the offspring of our own choice, influenced and unawed, adopted upon full investigation and mature deliberation, completely free in its principles, in the distribution of its powers uniting security with energy, and containing within itself a provision for its own amendment, as a just claim to your confidence and your support. Respect for its authority, compliance with its laws, acquiescence in its measures, are duties enjoined by the fundamental maxims of true liberty. The basis of our political systems is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government. But the Constitution which at any time exists, until changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, is sacredly obligatory upon all. Very idea of the power and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government.
Bill Hartman comes out and says,
congrats on the Constitution. It sure beats those Articles of Confederation. Our Constitution is really great. It separates powers, establishes freedom. It even allows you to amend it in case we forgot anything.
Richard Pryor comes out and says,
you mean like outlawing slavery?
Department. Exactly. Washington.
If I may go off script for a moment, of all the regrets I have in my role in helping conduct the great experiment that was the founding of this country, none will ever be greater than allowing the continuation of slavery. I cannot ever commence to attempt such an undertaking as that of attempting to adequately express the remorse I will always harbor based on the detestable truth that such an evil institution existed in my lifetime. My apologies can only serve to do so much in the present time, and I hope that more is done to rectify what was such a terrible situation.
Pryor. Damn right. Washington.
All obstructions to the execution of the laws, all combinations and associations under whatever plausible character with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities are destructive of this fundamental principle and of fatal tendency. They serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and, according to the alternate triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans, digested by common councils and modified by mutual interests. However combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which has lifted them to unjust dominion.
Jan Hooks comes out and says, trying to undermine the constituted government is destructive and will allow the will of a party to override the will of the country and will make the country mirror things how only that party wants them instead of how everyone wants them. So no matter how convenient parties may seem, it's likely over time that they will be used by cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men to take for themselves the control of government. Washington.
Towards the preservation of your government and the permanency of your present happy state, it is requisite not only that you steadily discontinuance irregular oppositions to its acknowledged authority, but also that you resist with care the spirit of innovation upon its principles, however specious the pretext. One method of assault may be to effect in the forms of the Constitution alterations which will impair the energy of the system and thus to undermine what cannot be directly overthrown. In all the changes to which you may be invited, remember that time and habit are at least as necessary to fix the true character of governments as of other human institutions. That experience is the surest standard by which to test the real tendency of the existing constitution of a country. That facility in changes upon the credit of mere hypotheses and opinion exposes to perpetual change from the endless variety of hypotheses and opinion. And remember, especially that for the efficient management of your common interests in a country so extensive as ours, a government of as much vigor as is consistent with the perfect security of liberty is indispensable. Liberty itself will find in such a government, with powers properly distributed and adjusted, its surest guardian. It is indeed little else than a name, where the government is too feeble to withstand the enterprises of faction, to confine each member of society within the limits prescribed by the laws, and to maintain all in the secure and tranquil enjoyment of the rights of person and property.
Norm MacDonald comes out and says,
if you want to keep your government, you got to be leery of those who oppose it and want to change all its principles. So maybe if something's not working, instead of fiddling everything around, use time, habit, and experience to fix the issue. And if you really want a government that works for everybody, you need it to be one that perfectly secures liberty. But liberty won't last if it gets fucked up by the parties. Washington. I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally.
Denitra Vance comes out and says,
"You thought I was shitting on parties before? Wait till you hear what I have to say next."
Washington.
The spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed. But in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy.
George Carlin comes out and says,
"Parties come from human nature, and therefore suck."
Washington.
The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty.
John Adams comes out and says,
"Parties continuing to battle each other over petty revenge leads to cruel oppression. The attitude this bullshit causes among people leads to party leaders exploiting the angst for their own personal ends."
Washington.
Without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it in the interest and the duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another.
Thomas Jefferson comes out and says,
"It's both in their best interests and the duty of intelligent people to discourage parties, because they suck. Parties distract from the work that needs to be done in the government, and they rile people up, create hatred amongst each other, which creates riot and insurrection."
Philip Seymour Hoffman as Joe King comes out and says, "Both real and imaginary." Jefferson.
"This atmosphere can lead to corruption and foreign influence, and cause the country's direction to be run merely by those few who run the parties."
Washington.
There is an opinion that parties in free countries are useful checks upon the administration of the government and serve to keep alive the spirit of liberty. This, within certain limits, is probably true. And in governments of a monarchical caste, patriotism may look with indulgence, if not with favor, upon the spirit of party. But in those of the popular character, in governments purely elective, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. From their natural tendency, it is certain there will always be enough of that spirit for every salutary purpose. And there being constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be by force of public opinion to mitigate and assuage it. A fire not to be quenched it demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest instead of warming it, should consume.
James Madison comes out and says, maybe with kings, parties can help preserve liberty. But with a popularly elected government, parties are prone to excess and will burn the whole frickin' place down if their fire is quenched. Washington.
It is important likewise that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus to create, whatever the form of government, a real despotism. A just estimate of that love of power and proneness to abuse it which predominates in the human heart is sufficient to satisfy us of the truth of this position. The necessity of reciprocal checks in the exercise of political power, by dividing and distributing it into different depositories, and constituting each the guardian of the public weal against invasions by the others, has been evinced by experiments ancient and modern, some of them in our country and under our own eyes. To preserve them must be as necessary as to institute them. If in the opinion of the people the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation. For though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. Precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield.
James Monroe comes out and says,
intelligence should stop politicians from invading other branches of government, or there'll be oppression. If something proves wrong, amend it constitutionally. Don't let human nature get in the way for a short-term benefit gotten by force, or you'll fuck the whole thing up.
Washington.
It is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. The rule indeed extends with more or less force to every species of free government. Who that is a sincere friend to it can look with indifference upon attempts to shake the foundation of the fabric? Promote then, as an object of primary importance, institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. In proportion as the structure of a government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened.
John Quincy Adams comes out and says, not being an asshole is necessary for the government to work correctly. Therefore, promote the spread of knowledge, because we don't want ignorant people voting in a bunch of assholes. Washington.
In the execution of such a plan, nothing is more essential than that permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others should be excluded, and that in place of them just and amicable feelings towards all should be cultivated. The nation which indulges towards another an habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. Antipathy in one nation against another disposes each more readily to offer insult and injury, to lay hold of slight causes of umbrage, and to be haughty and intractable when accidental or trifling occasions of dispute occur. Hence frequent collisions, obstinate, envenomed, and bloody contests. The nation, prompted by ill will and resentment, sometimes impels to war the government, contrary to the best calculations of policy. The government sometimes participates in the national propensity and adopts through passion what reason would reject. At other times it makes the animosity of the nation subservient to projects of hostility instigated by pride, ambition, and other sinister and pernicious motives. The peace often, sometimes perhaps the liberty, of nations has been the victim.
Benjamin Franklin comes out and says,
Nothing is more important than being civil to everyone. Obsessing over hating or loving any other country or group only serves to make one a slave to those feelings and will lead to unnecessary war and destruction that in no way will keep you free. You know, like the Patriot Act.
Washington.
Though in reviewing the incidents of my administration, I am unconscious of intentional error, I am nevertheless too sensible of my defects not to think it probable that I may have committed many errors. Whatever they may be, I fervently beseech the Almighty to avert or mitigate the evils to which they may tend. I shall also carry with me the hope that my country will never cease to view them with indulgence, and that, after 45 years of my life dedicated to its service with an upright zeal, the faults of incompetent abilities will be consigned to oblivion, as myself must soon be to the mansions of rest. Relying on its kindness in this as in other things, and actuated by that fervent love towards it which is so natural to a man who views in it the native soil of himself and his progenitors for several generations, I anticipate with pleasing expectation that retreat in which I promise myself to realize without alloy the sweet enjoyment of partaking in the midst of my fellow citizens the benign influence of good laws under a free government, the ever-favorite object of my heart, and the happy reward, as I trust, of our mutual cares, labors, and dangers.
Alexander Hamilton comes out and says,
As I leave, while I didn't try to fuck anything up, what can I say? I'm human too. I wasn't perfect. I ask God to mitigate the wrongs of my time as president, and that my faults will die with me. So as I go off into the sunset, I expect that there will be a reward for everyone from the positive influence of good laws under a free government.
Washington.
We have a great show tonight. Nothing is more agreeable and ornamental than good music. That's why I could not be more pleased to say that my granddaughter, Eleanor Nelly Custis, is here to play the harpsichord. We'll be right back.